In even the most prejudiced murder trial there is one essential element: there has to have been a killing. Fancy legal terminology generally requires a body, the corpus delictus as the TV detective shows are fond of telling us. It would seem reasonable, if one was to promulgate the theory of blitzkrieg slaughter as have Martin and Diamond, to identify where the bodies are buried and then take the reader on a gut-wrenching tour through a graveyard of waste and butchery. We are deprived of this vicarious thrill because the evidence of the destruction of the megafauna suggests a scenario well outside the orthodox interpretation of benign natural processes. Therefore mere mention of the reality of the situation is anathema to most scholars. So let us see what the actual situation is. The first explorers of the northern shores of Siberia and its offshore northern islands and of the interior of Alaska and some of its northern islands were stunned to discover an astronomical number of bones of prehistoric animals piled indiscriminately in hills and buried in the ground. The graveyards of these animals were classified as antediluvian, prior to Noah's flood, by the majority of scientists and lay people alike who still believe the stories of the Old Testament. Near these graveyards, incidentally, but located in riverbanks on the northern shore of Siberia, are found the famous Siberian mammoths whose flesh was supposedly edible when thawed. Reading an extensive set of quotations is always tedious to readers, but I hope you will bear with me in this chapter because it is only in the repetition of the reports of the discoveries of these areas that the entire picture of the demise of the mammoths and other creatures really becomes clear. These Siberian remains are not the thousands of mammoth bones which Jared Diamond thinks are searched frantically by archaeologists seeking signs of human butchery. It is doubtful that any archaeologists or paleontologists have made extensive studies of the skeletons in these locations, or we would certainly have a far different view of megafauna extinction than is presently acceptable to orthodox scholars. Russian expeditions to Siberia and the northern islands of the Arctic Ocean began in the latter half of the 18th century, and with the discovery of these large mounds of animal bones, most prominently the tusks of mammoths and other herbivores, franchises were given to enterprising people who could harvest the ivory for the world market. Lyakov seems to have been the first important ivory trader and explorer in the late 18th century. After his death the Russian government gave a monopoly to a businessman in Yakutsk who sent his agent, Sannikov, to explore the islands and locate additional sources of ivory. Sannikov's discoveries of more islands and his reports on the animal remains found there are the best first-hand accounts of the Siberian animal graveyards. Heddenstrom explored the area in 1809 and reported back on the richness of the ivory tusks. Sannikov discovered the island of Kotelnoye, which is apparently the richest single location, in 1811. Finally, the Tsar decided to send an official expedition, and from 1820 to 1823, Admiral Ferdinand Rangel, then a young naval lieutenant, did a reasonably complete survey of the area. Since these expeditions and explorations were inspired by commercial interests and not scientific curiosity, the reports are entirely objective with no ideological or doctrinal bias to slant the interpretation of the finds. Around the turn of the century interest in the Siberian lands seems to have increased, whether as a result of the few Christian fundamentalists who were not reconciled to evolution frantically searching for tangible proof of Noah's flood, or as part of the leisure activities of the English gentlemen of the time, we can't be sure. The definitive article on the Siberian prehistoric animal remains was written by the Reverend D. Gath Whitley and published by the Philosophical Society of Great Britain under the title The Ivory Islands in the Arctic Ocean. It drew on older sources, primarily reports of expeditions of the ivory traders, and captured the spectacular nature of the discoveries well. Lyakov discovered, on an island that now bears his name, rather substantial cliffs composed primarily of frozen sand and hundreds of elephant tusks. Later, when the Russian government sent a surveyor, Chuoinov, to the island, he reported that, with the exception of some high mountains, the island seemed to be composed of ice and sand and bones and tusks of ants or mammoths, which were simply cemented together by the cold. Famous baby mammoth mummies, Masha and Dima. Source, www.biodiversity.org. Click and drag photo to resize. Sannikov explored Kotelnoye and found that this large island was full of the bones and teeth of elephants, rhinoceroses, and musk oxen. Having explored the coasts, Sannikov determined, as there was nothing but bar wrens along the shore, to cross the island. He drove in reindeer sledges up the Zarina River, over the hills, and down the Sannikov River, and completed the circuit of the island. All over the hills in the interior of the island Sannikov found the bones and tusks of ants, rhinoceroses, buffaloes, and horses in such vast numbers that he concluded that these animals must have lived in the island in enormous herds when the climate was milder. Heddenstrom explored Lyakov's island in 1809 and discovered that the quantity of fossil ivory was so enormous that, although the ivory diggers had been engaged in collecting ivory from it for 40 years, the supply seemed to be quite undiminished. On an expanse of sand little more than half a mile in extent, Heddenstrom saw 10 tusks of mammoths sticking up, and as the ivory hunters had left these tusks because there were still other places where the remains of mammoths were still more abundant, the enormous quantities of elephants' tusks and bones in the island may be imagined. Indeed, a number of explorers reported that after each ocean storm the beaches were littered with bones and tusks which had been lying on the sea by them and brought to shore by wave action. The elephant or mammoth bones and tusks were the most spectacular finds primarily because they were so plentiful and consequently they attracted public attention the most. The islands contained an incredible mixture of bones of many extinct and some living species of mammals. Mixed with the animal bones were trees in all kinds of conditions. Whitley quoted some of the Russian explorers as reporting, "It is only in the lower strait of the New Siberian wood hills that the trunks have that position which they would assume in swimming or sinking undisturbed. On the summit of the hills they lie flung upon another in the wildest disorder, forced upright in spite of gravitation, and with their tops broken off or crushed, as if they had been thrown with great violence from the south on the bank, and there heaped up." A few conclusions can be drawn from the reports of the Russian ivory traders. First, it appeared that several reasonably large islands were built primarily of animal bones, heaped in massive hills and held together by frozen sand. To indicate the scope of the debris, we should note that all of these islands are found on modern maps of the area, indicating that we are not talking about little tracts of land of limited area. Second, the seafloor north of Siberia and surrounding the islands was covered with so many additional bones that it was worthwhile for the ivory traders to check the beaches after every storm to gather up tusks and other bones. Third, and very important for estimating the scope of the disaster, the ivory was of outstanding quality, so much so that the area provided most of the world's ivory for over a century. Estimates of the number of tusks taken from the islands range in the neighborhood of 100,000 pairs taken between the 1770s and the 1900s. Whitley noted that Sinikov himself had brought away 10,000 pounds of fossil ivory from New Siberia Island alone in 1809.9. In reality, however, only about a quarter of the ivory was of commercial grade, so the true figure must approach 500,000 pairs of tusks. Fourth, an amazing variety of animals, many extinct, were mixed with the mammoth and rhinoceros bones, although these two animals have become symbolic of the whole menagerie. Fifth, trees, plants, and other floral materials were indiscriminately mixed with the animal remains, sometimes leading the Russians to suppose that the islands represented a sunk isthmus or broad stretch of land where these animals and the companion plants lived in a warmer climate. The chaotic natural stratification of the remains soon abused that notion. Finally, it is important to note that none of the bones of any of the species had carving or butchering marks made by human beings. N.K.Vereshchagin wrote, "The accumulations of mammoth bones and carcasses of mammoth, rhinoceros, and bison found in frozen ground in Indochirka, Kolikma, and Novosibirsk lands bear no trace of hunting or activity of primitive man. Here large herbivorous animals perished and became extinct because of climatic and geomorphic changes, especially changes in the regime of winter snow and increase in depth of snow cover. The climatic and geomorphic changes must have been very sudden indeed and exceedingly violent, considering the fact that these bones are always described as heaps of material deposited as if they had been thrown into a pile by an incredibly strong force." The testimony regarding the richness of the animal remains in the Arctic north of the continental masses is not restricted to Russian sources. Stephen Tabor, writing in his report, "Pereni, Ally Frozen Ground in Alaska, Its Origins in History," had this to say about the Siberian Islands. Feisenmayer states that in the New Siberia Island collectors have found inexhaustible supplies of mammoth bones and tusks as well as bones and horns of rhinoceros and other diluvial mammals, and Dr. Bang, during expeditions in the summers of 1882-1884, gathered almost 2,500 first-class mammoth tusks on the New Siberian islands of Lyakov, Kotelny, and Fatayev, although many collectors had previously obtained ivory from the islands since their discovery in 1770 by Lyakov. It would seem obvious to anyone seriously pursuing the question of the demise of the mammoth and the other mecha herbivores that a good place to locate the bodies to determine the cause of their demise would be the islands north of the Siberian Peninsula. Yet we hear not a word about them in scientific articles and books concerning the overkill hypothesis.